All right, welcome everybody. The name of this session is Staying Safe While Getting Loud. We're going to talk about sound exposure in the concert sound world and some related concepts that will be helpful to understand. My name is Michael Lawrence. I'm an SPL application specialist with Rational Acoustics. We make a software audio analyzer called SMART that is used by sound engineers around the world to measure, optimize, and tune their PA systems. And my little corner of that is that I work on the SPL feature set in particular. So we'll talk about some of the things that will help you in your understanding of sound exposure in the context of concert sound. So what are some of the takeaways that we need to know to keep ourselves safe, to keep our fellow crew members safe, and of course to keep the audience safe as well. The first thing we're going to talk about is the question that everybody asks me right, when they find out that I work on this software. They say, well, why don't they give out earplugs at concerts? And I'm going to tell you why I think that's the wrong question. Then we're going to talk about SPL, how that relates to human loudness perception and what we need to understand about the similarities and differences. Then we're going to talk about how loud is too loud, right? We're going to see if we can sort of quantify the issue of sound exposure. And once we know what's safe and what's not, we could compare that to some actual data that I've gathered from concerts. And you can see how loud concerts are and what these sound exposure numbers tend to be for a typical concert. And then at the end of that, we're going to talk about actually enacting some SPL speed limits. So either if you're a venue or a promoter who's going to be putting these rules in place, or if you're a touring mix engineer and you have to comply with these rules, what are some of the things you want to keep in mind so this can be done effectively and productively? And then finally, I'll show you a little trick. A lot of the stuff that we do is working with mixing engineers to help them understand how to mix a show that's at a safe level, but is still engaging to the audience and gives them that dynamic concert experience. I'm going to show you one little trick that those of us here today who are mix engineers can use to kind of work around the limits a little bit, but still keep it safe. So here's the question. When I tell people that I'm a live sound engineer, they always say, hey, why don't they give out earplugs at concerts? And I think this question is really revealing, and it really speaks to the passive role of an audience member at a show, right? They really don't have much control over the sound level that they're subjected to. They just know it's going to be loud, and they've gotten that inherent expectation, and they're showing up with earplugs in their pocket. And it's a little bit of a sad state of affairs that we've gotten to the point where the expectation of the average concert goer is this is going to be so loud, I'm going to be uncomfortable, or it's going to be potentially dangerous, and I need to protect myself against that. So how do we get here, right? Why is that now the norm? Why is that the expectation? And there are a lot of factors that play into this, but I want to focus on two big ones. The first one that I want to focus on is this idea that louder is better, right? And it's a flimsy psychological principle, but it's absolutely true. If you give a human being two audio samples that are identical and one has a level set to like 1/10 of a dB higher, the human will always pick the louder one as being better. Our loud sounds, just our brain enjoys them. And there's a lot of kind of fallout from that in the recording and mastering industry. It kicked off this 15-year thing called the Loudness Wars, where people were trying to squeeze every last bit of level out of their records, because if your record sounds louder than the next person's record, your record will be perceived as better. And so, we're up against a lot of human evolution here. So one of the things we're going to do is look a little bit at the psychoacoustic principles of the human hearing mechanism. We're going to see how that works and sort of what we can do. But we're also up against physics in a very basic sense. Part of this is dictated by the physical universe in which we occupy. And so the idea that as you back away from a sound source, it loses level, right? That sound source is radiating energy, and the further away we get, it's radiating that energy is spread over a larger distance. And so this is where we get to really the root of the issue, or one of the main causes. For a long time in the early days of sound reinforcement, the best that we could do was stack up a bunch of speakers on the edge of the stage, and then you had to turn them up really loud so you could get to the back, right? The problem with that is that the people up in front are getting absolutely steamrolled. They got a speaker right in the face. And so for a long time said, yeah, it's unfortunate, it's going to be louder in front because we have to turn it up loud enough so we can get that energy all the way to the back. And it's kind of funny that, we've sort of figured this out, even for people that have no technical understanding of audio. I always laugh when I go to my town has concerts on the green during the summer, and all the old ladies come out with their folding chairs and they set them all the way across the back of the field as far away as they can get. And that's because they've just got this innate understanding that we don't want to have a loud experience here, so we're going to get as far away from it as we can, right? Humans know that sound loses level over distance. But more recently, what we've been able to do is fly those PA systems, get those PA systems up in the air, right? And so the thing is that we still have that long throw to the back, but we've made the throw to the front a lot longer as well. And so not only do we have someone who's now not in the front row getting a speaker right in the face, but we've also, by making the throw to the front longer as well, we've reduced the level variance. So it's now not a 20 dB difference from front to back. It might be a 12 dB difference from front to back, or even a 6 dB difference from front to back, right? So this simple geometry, and it doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but really just being able to get that thing up in the air has really brought us to a point as a field that we can leverage our modern technologies. We have some really great articulated line arrays. We have some really great beam steering technology that we can use. And so we now have the ability in the present day and age to create a concert environment where pretty much wherever you sit, you're going to get a similar level, a similar experience. So we now have that ability. And so since we have that ability to really control pretty finely the sound level over the course of the listening area, we have to return to this question now. So if we have the ability to do this, then why are we still running the show so loud? Why don't we just turn it down for everybody now that we no longer have to crank it up to get that level in the front? And that's a really good question. Here's a couple photos from the before times, right, when we had shows. On the left, you can see that these speakers down here in the front are right next to the American flag there. This picture was taken from the booth, and you can see that we have level monitoring software up on the screen there. And so this is a situation where we're in the booth running the show. We can say, yeah, this is an appropriate level. It's a safe level. And those statements may not be true for those people that are sitting way down in those first couple seats. They're really close to that speaker. That's not a place I want to sit to hear this show, right? Whereas if we look on the right, you can see that characteristic J shape of the modern line array. And so it's up, it's out of people's faces. We can aim more boxes towards the back where we need to throw more of that energy because it's further away. We aim fewer boxes down towards the front. That's where the J shape comes from, right? So this has been a paradigm shift, and it doesn't really sound like a big deal. And if you're in audio, it's kind of something we take for granted. But the simple act of getting the PA up in the air is huge when it comes to this. So let's take a step back. Let's define our terms. What is SPL? Now, we're not going to go down the rabbit hole on this, but we're going to give you a little bit of a foundational information just so you can kind of follow what we're talking about. Sound pressure level is a measure of the strength of air pressure deviations that is caused by a sound wave. So as the sound wave goes through the air, it vibrates those air molecules back and forth, and we're just measuring the strength of that deflection. So if you want to picture a ball that's bobbing on the surface of the ocean, right? And as the wave goes by, that ball goes up and down. We're measuring the height of that. We're not measuring the ambient sea level, just like we're not measuring ambient air level when we measure SPL. It's expressed in decibels, and we don't need to get into the math because no one wants to talk about that. But what you do need to know is that it happens on a scale of 0 dB SPL to about 120 dB SPL. At the bottom of that scale, 0, that's the threshold of human hearing. That's the quietest sound a human can hear under normal conditions. Up at the top around 120, that's the threshold of pain, and you're well into immediate permanent damage. That's just a bad place to be, okay? So everything that we hear in our daily lives happens somewhere in between those two extremes, hopefully. And here's the crux of the issue. This is where we start to get into trouble. The fact that SPL is an objective measurement of a physical reality, right? We're measuring those sound waves. And then the fact that human loudness perception is very, very different. It's very complicated, and there's a lot of factors that play into this that still aren't completely well understood. It's things like the tonal balance of the content. If it's intelligible, a lot of people say, hey, turn it up, I can't hear, and they don't mean that it's not at a high enough level, they mean the intelligibility is poor. So how intelligible the signal is, how much distortion is in the signal, how tired your ears are, whether or not you like the material you're listening to, all of these play into our loudness perception. And so that all boils down to a couple of things, but really what it means is that we are really bad judges of sound level. So it's perfectly possible to be at a concert and be completely comfortable and be happy and be exposed to an objectively dangerous sound pressure level. And it's also possible to be in a situation where music is playing at an objectively safe level, but it's very uncomfortable to you and you want it to be turned down, it feels like it's too loud. So this is why we can't rely on our loudness perception to tell us whether or not we're safe. So for loudness, use your ears. For SPL, use a meter, okay? And there's a little bit of mythology that we have to dig into here. If you look at a sound level meter that you might have lying around, one of the, the venerable Radio Shack units, or an app that you might download on your phone, you've got to choose from weighting filters. And so basically the idea with all of the weighting filter stuff is that this was rooted in what's now 90-year-old Genesis. And it says that since the tonal response of human hearing varies over level, right? At lower levels, we're less sensitive to bass. We need more bass in our signal at lower levels for it to sound balanced, and then less so when it gets turned up. So the attempt was to use different weighting filters on the measurement at different levels so we could produce a measurement that looks like it sounds. Well, there's a couple issues with this. First of all, the research that this was based on bears very little resemblance to the currently accepted values. So the data is flawed, right? But the bigger problem is that producing an objective measurement and then tweaking it so it looks like we think it should is a little bit like changing the calibration on your bathroom scale until it reads the weight that you want it to. The whole point of an objective measurement is that it doesn't matter what it sounds like to us. We need some objective data here. So there's a little bit of fallout, but what we're stuck with here is the C-weighted curve, which is here in blue, and that just has a little bit of roll-off at the frequency extremes. And we have the A-weighted curve, which is here in red, and it has a lot of low-frequency roll-off. So that bass energy is not going to be included in the A-weighted measurement. And what we need to know is that although the A-weighted filter was originally designed to represent the tonal response of human ears at very low levels, so not at all representative of what we might encounter in a typical concert situation, statistically, it ends up being a really good model for the range of frequencies that do tend to cause hearing damage. So sort of by accident, we have a really good weighting filter that allows us to statistically predict noise-induced hearing loss. So if you look at guidance from NIOSH, from OSHA, from the World Health Organization, which we're going to talk about, those are A-weighted measures. And so it's a little bit counterintuitive to people that have a little bit of familiarity with this stuff to say, well, that's for low levels, why are we using it? It has nothing to do with your perceived tonal shift. It just ends up statistically working out. The numbers allow us to predict pretty well what's going to damage your hearing. Now, there's an important myth here that we don't want to fall into, and that's that bass energy can't damage your hearing. That's not true. The ear is a lot more resilient down there, so it can take a lot more, but if you were something like in the front row at an EDM concert for 8 hours next to those subwoofers, that's a really bad situation, and we definitely want to be aware of that and do things to mitigate that. But in general, the A-weighted energy tends to be a really good predictor for us, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So there's one other thing we have to touch on. And again, we're not going to deep dive into all the metrics, but the two integration times that you get to choose from on a typical handheld meter are slow and fast. Slow is a 1 second integration time. Fast is an eighth of a second integration time. And the problem that we have is our music has dynamic range, right? We're not listening to steady state tones or steady state industrial noise. Our songs have loud parts and soft parts, and then we have loud songs and quiet songs. So the problem with the fast and slow metrics is that they're so jittery, they bounce around so quickly, that it's very difficult for us to look at data and make an objective statement about what was the level of the last song, what was the level of the last verse, what was the level of the show. To illustrate that, I've got a timeline here. This is 30 minutes of data from a concert that I metered a couple years ago, and you can see that if the venue policy says you got to keep it under 92A, are we violating? It's difficult to say, again, because there's so much deflection in that meter. It responds so quickly that within the course of 1 or 2 seconds, you could have a 10 dB swing. So it's just really difficult to make an objective, meaningful statement about the level of the show. So for our purposes, what we tend to do is use a different metric that's called LEQ, and it's an equivalent continuous average, basically. So we're always looking at the last X number of minutes. So for example, LEQ 10 would be a 10-minute average. And we're going to look at that level over the last 10 minutes, and we're going to average it and produce an equivalent value. And so if we start to do that, if we start to zoom out and look at longer and longer windows with more context, what we can see is, I'll show you the same data again, but now with the LEQ 10 over the top. Now it starts to settle down, and it kind of removes a lot of that jittery from the reading, and we can see that, all right, now it's very, very easy for us to look at this and make a meaningful statement about what sort of levels are we dealing with here. And so, yes, if the rule is keep it under 92, we are compliant. But this really starts to illustrate why it's so important that we have to clearly indicate what the rules are. And we're going to talk more about that too. So let's talk about exposure, because this is really kind of the heart and soul of what we're dealing with today, right? There are a lot of other reasons to take SPL measurements, but obviously we're here today for Event Safety Alliance, and we want to talk about what's safe. So exposure is sort of becoming a more visible topic as we go. And it's something that, it's not the 1950s in smoking anymore. We can't pretend that we don't know. When you go to a concert, you're exposed to potentially dangerous sound levels. And so the first step is that we're starting to build some awareness about that as a field. So how do we quantify this? So again, we're dealing with A-weighted levels. And it's a little bit like a dose if you were working around radioactive materials, right? The higher level you're exposed to, the faster you run through your clock of what's safe, your exposure time. And so when I mention this stuff to my friends and family around the table, for the holidays or whatever, they always say, "Well, I know what's too loud? How many dB?" And they want a number. And exposure doesn't really work like that. It's all about how loud for how long. So the longer you're exposed to it, the lower that safe level gets. And there are two main sources of guidance on this that we're going to talk about today. The first is OSHA, and people probably have the most familiarity with OSHA. OSHA has what's called permissible exposure levels. And they're based on an 8-hour shift, and they're kind of prorated for different exposure times. So we can see here that OSHA says for an 8-hour shift, you want to be exposed to a maximum of 90 dBA. And notice that as the level goes up, the amount of time that you can be exposed to that comes down. Now, there's a really dangerous bit of mythology around this, and that is that as long as you're abiding by OSHA's levels, it's safe, you're hearing safe. And that is absolutely not true. The thing to remember is that OSHA tells you what is permissible. This indicates the threshold of legal liability. It's not at all about protecting your hearing. It's when it's gotten so bad that liability comes into the picture. And so that's really, really important to understand. There's a link down here at the bottom from a NIOSH document where they talk about the historical basis for the OSHA permissible exposure levels, and they get into the statistics of how many people, what percentage of people after a career at these levels still had hearing loss. It's pretty high. It's pretty scary. So if our concern is actually keeping people safe, we turn to NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. And NIOSH has recommended exposure levels. So there's sort of a little tell in the name, right? It's not what's permissible, it's what we recommend. And this can be more thought of as a safe dose. And if your intent is actually preserving your hearing and avoiding noise-induced hearing loss, this is the stuff that we want to pay attention to in terms of, are we abiding by NIOSH, right? And so you'll notice that all of a sudden the 8-hour shift has gone down to 85 dBA. And you'll also notice that as the level goes up by 3 dB, it halves the recommended exposure time. So when we get up to typical concert levels, which tend to be in the mid-90s and sometimes even higher, we see that recommended exposure time is very, very short. It's shorter than the duration of a typical concert. So that should be a little bit of an alarm bell. Now, it's perfectly reasonable at this point to say, well, this is based on occupational data, and, the person who's going to a show doesn't go to the show every day. And that's absolutely true. And there's a couple things that you want to keep in mind with that. The first is that this is all based on statistics of what tends to cause damage and what doesn't, right? So even though you're not being exposed to it every day, there's still a lot of evidence that when you start to go over these levels, it's just not good for you. But the elephant in the room here, and I think something that we're all pretty much aware of here today, is that, we are, of course, concerned about the safety and well-being of our audience members, but we are also concerned about the safety and well-being of ourselves and the artists who have hired us and the other people who work on the show with us. And way before it causes a problem for the audience member who's going to a show 4 times a year, it's going to cause a problem for us who do 4 shows a week, right? So we are way more likely to damage ourselves with this stuff than we are the occasional audience concert goer. And so that's sort of the part that people aren't really tending to talk about. So we do go from OSHA, where after a career at these levels, something like 25% of people meet their definition of a hearing loss, which is pretty scary by our terms, right? It's like 25 dB loss in both ears. And then we go to NIOSH, and it's something like 6 or 7%. So NIOSH is objectively a lot better at preventing noise-induced hearing loss. Okay, there's also guidance from the World Health Organization, and that is targeted more at recreational listeners, the people who aren't being exposed to this stuff every day. That is what, if you have a smart device, an Apple Watch that's going to tell you, hey, you're being exposed to super high sound levels. This is not safe. You should leave, right? That stuff is typically based on the World Health Organization guidance, and they have an initiative called Make Listening Safe, and that's a great resource as well. But for our purposes, it's a little bit more nebulous in terms of how to quantify that. So the NIOSH works really well in that we can meter it and we can objectively say, hey, you've reached your limit for the day. And that's something that we're doing within Smart. These are dosimeters. They're just like what you would wear, again, if you worked around radioactive equipment, and these are in percentages. So when this hits 100, you've absorbed your safe dose or your permissible dose, if we're talking about OSHA. So on the left, we have our O exposure, which is the OSHA model. And on the right, we have our N exposure, which is the NIOSH model. And it's a little bit scary to see that we are approaching a full NIOSH dose, and OSHA hasn't even hit 5% yet. And that just illustrates how far apart these really are. And it also illustrates the danger of saying, yeah, if we're under OSHA, we're safe. You're not safe. One thing that I did that kind of makes me giggle a little bit is that unlike the rest of our meters, these will turn red. The green text will turn red when it hits 100. And you can't change that as a user. It's hard-coded into the software. And I've had more than one front-of-house engineer say to me after testing this stuff, man, I really don't like seeing that red all night. And I'm like, yeah, well, that's the point, dude. It's you're not supposed to. That's bad, right? So now that we understand a little bit of context about this, let's talk about how loud concerts actually are. So what I did is over 2019, I went to a bunch of concerts, and I gathered some representative data here. And I put it into this table. There's a lot of stuff going on in this slide, and most of it is targeted for sound engineers who understand all the metrics. But the takeaways here should be pretty clear, right? As we go from left to right, the duration of the concert increases. So we have the shortest events on the left, we have the longest events on the right. And so it should be obvious that, it goes back to what I said. It's not just about how loud, but it's about how loud for how long. And so the longer duration events, the festivals, the multi-act shows, have a much higher risk of being dangerous simply because of the duration, even if the levels are reasonable for that whole time. So the other thing to point out is that some of these events, people are leaving with, this is a 3-hour, this prog rock event here is a 3-hour event, and people left with 1,000% NIOSH dose. So they left with 10 days of sound exposure in an afternoon. The metal show on the right was one of those, I think 5 or 6 bands on the bill, and people left with 1,400%. That is 2 weeks of sound exposure in one day. Okay. And so this is problematic. This is really problematic, and especially for the people like us who are working and are at these events every night. So there's definitely a problem here, right? It's definitely something that we as an industry need to really start taking a little more seriously, because we are objectively doing things to people that are unsafe. And it's no different than our professional obligation as a rigger or as a show electrician to do things that are not going to injure the people attending the show or injure the people working on the show. We're right there in that same boat, ethically, professionally, right? So we're going to talk about what do we do, right? What do we do now that we know for a fact that this is not safe stuff? Part of this is a deployment issue, right? It's about how we design and implement that sound system. And so that largely falls to the system engineer, whose job it is to design the system in the show every night, how they're going to hang that system, how they're going to tune that system. Larger tours generally carry their own system, so this is something that has to be sorted out every day. And it could be an implementation issue. And if you recall the examples from earlier where we said, hey, it's louder in the front here. The data that I just showed was gathered from front of house. So at front of house, we're saying 1,400% exposure. Well, what about down front where it's 6 dB louder even, right? So that's 4 times the exposure down there, right? So you're talking about 6,000% exposure roughly. That is frightening. It's truly frightening. So one of the things that we can do with our modern tool set is reduce that front to back variance. So yeah, we want the show to be a little bit louder in front for a variety of reasons, but not 20 dB louder in front. So if we can just take 3 dB off that, we can have the exposure dose that we're giving people. And that's a huge gain, right? So if we can just have those exposure numbers, it doesn't take much, right? You can sand a little bit of the edges off pretty easily with modern equipment. But sort of on a macro sense, a lot of this is more about awareness. Like I said, you now have... the audience are sort of, more actively involved in this process now that a lot of them have smart devices that are alerting them to unsafe sound levels. So that's a good thing. It means that we don't hold any of all the cards anymore, and I think that's great, right? I think there needs to be some accountability there. Metering is becoming increasingly common at mix position. This is another great development. What we're seeing is more and more engineers choosing to use these tools, even when they're not required to. Even if there's not what we call, the sound police, someone's not standing over their shoulder threatening to fine them for $10,000 every minute they go over. Even when that stuff's not in the picture, we're still seeing engineers set these tools up and monitor them, and they're using them for consistency night to night, and they're using them to keep sort of a check on their levels. And part of that's quality control, but part of that is, health and safety concern. And so that's kind of a really nice trend in our industry, is that we are seeing engineers sort of take some accountability and say, yeah, even though no one's holding my feet to the fire on this, I still want to do it because it's the right thing to do. I want to know that I'm being safe. I care about not hurting people. Part of this is engineer education. So, there's a ton of data out there. Part of it, there's a AES paper linked at the bottom of this slide. It's a fantastic paper. I had the privilege of contributing a little bit to this paper. It's all about understanding and managing sound exposure at concerts, and there's a lot of great research in there. So how do we close that gap where the academic side of our field has decided, yeah, we now have a good idea of what this is. We know how bad of a problem it is. We know how to characterize this stuff. How do we sort of filter that down and get it to the boots on the ground, the people who are mixing these shows every night, the people who are ultimately in charge of making a decision about how loud the show is going to be? And so working with the engineers, I have a whole workshop where we work with mix engineers to understand these metrics, understand how to meter this stuff, understand what are some things they can do in their system design, what are some things they can do in their mixing, right? And that's kind of the last thing is teaching the mix engineers good habits and how to create a show that is at an objectively safe level and will not get them in violation of whatever policy they're trying to deal with, but also how do we give the audience that engaging, dynamic, impactful experience? Because I remind you, that is the whole point of going to a show, right? It still has to be fun for the audience. We want it to be fun and safe. So are there some techniques that we can use in our mix to kind of check all the boxes, right? Let's make sure we're safe, let's make sure that we're not going to get fined, and let's give the audience a great experience. And so it obviously is a little bit harder to do that because you can't use just sheer level as a sledgehammer, right? It's that kind of whole, thing about turn it up. And there's the Rolling Stones record, Let It Bleed. In the liner notes, it says this record is meant to be played loud. So there is this just blunt force, yeah, turn it up, it'll sound better, right? And part of that's because of those equal loudness contours that we looked at. The response of the ear actually changes. So, there are some things you could do in your mix to sort of emulate that and make it sound louder than it is, basically. So we are in a good spot, I think, in terms of starting to take some first steps on this. Here in the United States, we're way behind stuff that's happening in Europe. They're very heavily legislated, typically in Europe. There's a lot more awareness of this stuff. And in the U.S., we have sort of a patchwork of poor regulations or no regulations, and that's something that we could talk about a little bit. But there's a lot of distance to go on this. But I think the first step is just getting the awareness and getting people to acknowledge that, hey, we shouldn't be ignoring this anymore. I don't subscribe to the whole if it's too loud, you're too old thing. If it's too loud, let's turn it down. Let's not hurt people, right? So when we talk about SPL speed limits and what we're going to implement, there's three things that we need to look at. The first is that it has to be meaningful, right? It's got to be objective. It has to be technically enforceable. It can't be like, and we see this, every time the lady down the street calls and complains, you're going to get fined $1,000. Well, from a legal, actionable perspective, you can't really leave that up to someone else's feelings from day to day. So we have to have a rule, and the rule has to be objective, and it has to be something that we can measure. It has to be technically enforceable. It can't be when the bartender decides it's too loud. And so it has to be a number that we can clearly define and put up on a screen and say, if you stay under this number, you're fine. If you go over this, but it has to be basically a complete sentence from a technical aspect. We can't just say keep it under 91. We should say it has to be 91 dBA, 10-minute LEQ, measured at front of house. And so now we have a really good idea of what the rules are, but to just throw a number out is not enough information for an engineer to even make a good faith effort to monitor themselves. So it has to be meaningful. And part of that is having enough technical background that when we make a technical statement, it's an accurate technical statement. It has to be practical. So this is something that we're going to apply in a live concert environment. So if you have a number that's so low that turning on your vacuum at home would trigger a violation, that's just not going to work well. It's not realistic, right? So, we see some levels that are so low that you'd have to cancel the band. You have to turn the system off. Just the sound of the band playing on the stage with no amplification would trigger a violation. So we have to keep in mind of the context here, and we need to deal with that and put a limit that is practical for the circumstances. And finally, it has to be effective, right? It's got to achieve the stated goal. So what we're talking about here is keeping exposure to a reasonable point. And so if we put a limit that's so high that you get permanent hearing damage in 15 minutes and you still haven't triggered the violation, that's not effective. On the other hand, a lot of the laws that exist were, based in some kind of, it's sort of outmoded Noise Act from 1971 that sort of was enforced by the EPA for a while and is no longer enforced. But a lot of that stuff dealt with environmental, shipping yards and trains and stuff like that. A lot of the legislation in the U.S. is aimed at not bothering your neighbors. So it's noise pollution. It's nuisance noise. The problem with that is a lot of that tend to use the A-weighted curve that ignores all the base information. And what is most likely to travel through the walls of your structure, travel long distances outside, and actually be disruptive to people, it's the base energy. So in a lot of situations, you have a rule that people have to abide by, and they may be totally compliant, but since the rule doesn't characterize that base energy, you're still bothering people. So this is a rule that's not effective, right? You have people who are getting in trouble, the mayor's calling them up, and there's lawsuits flying because they are 100% compliant with the law, but people are still complaining, and that's because the rule that you made is not effective. So you have to have a stated goal. We're going to put a policy in place that is to protect against exposure for people at the show. We're going to put a policy in place that is to protect against the neighbors. We want to manage their level of nuisance noise. Okay, so that has to be clearly defining the goal from the first place, and then you say, okay, well, how can we get there? So what weighting curves do we need to use? What sort of time integration do we need to use? We have dozens and dozens of ways that we can meter this, but we have to choose one that's going to allow us to quantify the problem that we're trying to address, right? So for general exposure stuff where we want to sit, the 15-minute A-weighted average seems to work really well. So we're talking about that LAEQ 15. And the nice thing about a longer window, the 10 or 15-minute window, is it's manageable. It allows some dynamic impact. It allows some range on the part of the mix engineer. So they can push those levels, have a little bit of an impactful moment. They can pull it back and have a more intimate moment. It allows them to continue using loudness as a tool, as an artistic tool, right? That's part of their job. If you hold them to a 10-second window, you pretty much can't have any dynamic range in your performance. And so opening that window up a little bit is helpful. Now, opening it up so long, 60 minutes, for example, that's not a good choice. The band that was before you can use up all of that buffer, and then you're in a situation where you can't possibly comply because they were so loud, and that average is so loud that the previous performance is still counting against you. So a happy medium that we find is that 10 to 15 minute limit. A lot of the stuff that you will look at, particularly in Europe, says you have to meter this from the loudest audience accessible area. So metering it front of house is great. It's certainly a hell of a lot better than nothing. But if your show is 12 dB louder in the front, you may look like you're compliant for front of house, and you may be doing some real damage down front. So again, a lot of this, you need to figure out where you're going to measure it. And what we typically can't do during a show is put a mic in the loudest audience accessible area because it's audience accessible. But what we can do is we say, okay, well, we know that it's 5 dB louder at the loudest area than it is at front of house. And we can build that offset into our metering. And we can now have an idea of what's happening elsewhere in the venue. Another thing that we can do is monitor from multiple mics. So one at front of house, one in the security pit down front, one at the balcony front, right? We could do property line if we need to outside the venue, all of those things. So it's all about context here. We have to clearly define who's going to do this, right? So is it just you're printing out a sign and taping it to the wall at mix position? Is there a person at the venue who is designated to do this? Who do we talk to about this? I've worked at theaters where if the clock in the concession stand was vibrating, they would come out and tell you that was their limit. That's how they knew the show was too loud, right? So we need to have an idea of who's going to be responsible for measuring this, enforcing this, and then we have to give them an accurate measurement tool. I spent months looking at handheld tools, iPhone apps, all of these things that people might use to do this, and long story short, pretty much if you're using a handheld measurement tool that costs you less than a couple $100, or you're using an iPhone, you probably shouldn't trust what it's telling you on the screen, especially when we come to exposure. Because with exposure measurements, remember, only 3 dB doubles the exposure. So even if you're talking about a dB of error in your measurement, that compounds pretty quickly. And so this idea of what is a safe amount of time, that answer starts to get very, very nebulous. And you start to get very, very wide error bars around that number. Once you get to 2 dB off in your calibration, the uncertainty time in your exposure time is the same length as the event. So it only takes 2 dB of an accuracy to produce a completely meaningless exposure measurement. So it's really important for accuracy to have the accuracy, to have a calibrated solution, to have a documented solution. Otherwise, it doesn't get into, well, my phone says this and my phone says this. So when we're talking about exposure, having a calibrated measurement rig is a must. Now, in addition to that, having a compliant measurement rig. One that is lab verified and is tamper proof and, produces a higher level of accountability for the data. If you're talking about log files that need to go to court, we look towards specialty hardware solutions that are tamper proof, and they cost you a lot more per channel. And it's not that they're producing more accurate data, but it is that they're producing data that is tamper proof and is class compliant with the standard and is therefore trustworthy. So that's another conversation that we have to have is, do we have to prove this to anybody? Do we have to keep data on file for 7 days or 14 days? And if it needs to go to court, there are a bunch of other things we need to look at to make sure that the log files are kept in a way and produced in a way that means that's actually meaningful information. Transparency and clarity is the final thing to keep in mind. Again, it's got to be a number that's clearly defined, it's enforceable, and everyone's on the same page. It's not good to wait until 40 minutes into the show and then to go and tell the engineer that he's been violating for 20 minutes and he's going to be fined $10,000. It's got to be communicated well in advance. It has to be all parties on board are understanding of what the rule is, how it's going to be measured. And it's something we can all agree upon. There's a great story about this woman who lives down the street from a venue, and she calls every Friday night and complains about the sound. And one Friday night, the venue's closed and they don't have a show that week, and she still calls and complains. And it was just something that she did. Right? And so that really illustrates the point and the necessity of having something that is objective and transparent and that is all agreed upon, rather than living up to the whims of someone who's just a little irritable this week, right? And I'm not going to give you an exact number because I know that's what everyone's kind of hoping for, right? You're kind of hoping for me to just throw a number out and you're going, okay, we're going to stay into that and we're going to be good. Unfortunately, there's a lot of context to take in here if you're a nightclub, if you're a major festival, if you're a house of worship, right? But generally what we like to see is that LAEQ 15 limit that's set somewhere, in the very high 80s or low to mid 90s tends to be pretty typical. So you might see, 93, 94, 91, something like that. When you get up to 3 digits, you kind of jump the shark at that point. You're talking about, hitting your NIOSH dose in 15 minutes. So those are things that really need to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. And so feel free to reach out to us if anyone's kind of dealing with these issues. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that we can look at. But I'm not going to give you an exact number. But like I said, generally ballpark low 90s, LAEQ 15 is a reasonable place to start talking about this stuff. This is just a little kind of glimpse at my world during a show. I actually built myself a meter bridge that clips to my console. So I have this information right there in front of me. As I'm mixing, I'm monitoring the trends. I'm monitoring my NIOSH exposure. And I have to tell you, it's completely revolutionized the way I mix. And it's really allowed me to dig into using that loudness as a tool while keeping tabs on the health and safety situation. And like I said, we do a whole workshop on, helping mixers work with this stuff. And develop a mix that has impact and still working within the limits. This is just one little tidbit from that. This is an exercise that I call the LEQ traffic light. So what I've done is we're talking about a venue where, let's say our limit is 100A, okay, just to pick a round number. I've created a bunch of LEQ measurements in smaller and smaller time constants. So I've got a 15 minute, a 10 minute, a 4 minute, a 2 minute, a 1 minute, and a 10 second. I've gone into our software and I've set so all of them will turn red at 99, which is 1 dB below the limit. So that's where we're going to stop. And 2 dB below that at 97 is where we're going to turn yellow. And what you're going to see here is a video that is the last about 5 minutes of a show that was sped up. So we're going to see it happen really quickly. What you can see is as I briefly get the level up, that short-term meter starts to turn yellow. And as we stay higher for longer, that yellow starts to spread across the meters. And so what I end up with here is a situation where I can look up and within a split second, I have context on where my level is and how long I've been there. And so as that yellow starts to spread from left to right, I know, okay, it's probably time to pull it back. And you'll see that there are brief moments where I really do get into the red. And as we approach the end of the show here, a great example, I went to go see my friend Jason Moore, who mixes the band Train, and he mixed the whole night at a reasonable level. And once he got to the end, it's their big song, it's the last chorus, the confetti's coming down, everyone's going nuts, and he really put the pedal down. And it was this great moment that had a ton of impact, and it was really powerful, and it was also totally safe because he didn't stay there. Because he managed his level, so he allowed himself some room to get loud at times when he needed to. And so what you can see is there are times when I'm really pushing the dynamic range of this mix and I'm really getting up there, but I'm not staying there. And so we end up with a situation where that red is not pushing all the way down. That last meter, here's the big push at the end of the show here. I'm really, really crushing it. I'm 103.5 at the peak. And that red starts to spread across, but it doesn't make it all the way to the end. So our 15-minute measure that we're being held to is still comfortably below the limit, right? So this is a lot better approach for a mixing engineer than to just put that 15-minute LEQ up there and just say, all right, I hope that thing doesn't turn red and we don't have to pay 10 grand. Let's give you some more context, right? This is sort of a way to really take control and be able to stretch your legs within that limit and have a really good idea of how to proactively use that level while still staying safe. So that's just a little kind of glimpse into some of the cool stuff that we get to play with. I want to thank everyone very much for their attention. It's been really cool. So thank you to Jacob and Steve for asking me to speak today. I really enjoy this opportunity. I'm here today with Jamie Anderson, who's the president of Rational Acoustics. These are our email addresses, so feel free to reach out to us if you have questions or comments. And I'm really looking forward to discussing this topic more in the Q&A session. So Jamie and I are both here with you today to be able to discuss these things with you and answer your questions and hear your comments. And again, I really appreciate it. Thank you.